אוקיי, אז בואו נתחיל, גם למי שבבית חוזר ומצטרף אלינו, אז ברוכים הבאים וברוכים הבאות. אני עובר לאנגלית, אוקיי? So I'm going to be speaking in English for this session, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference today. And I want to say a few things about Professor Kanaan's Makia, introducing him before we give him the stage to speak. It can be said of very few people today. I think that they individually helped shape the course of history and change the lives of millions of people worldwide. But our keynote speaker, I would argue, and I'm not sure he would agree with me about this, but I would argue nevertheless that he's one of those people. I think in every history book that's already been written today, and probably definitely in those that will be written about the war in Iraq, Professor Kanaan's Makia plays a prominent role. His tireless advocacy for human rights and justice in the Middle East, and especially under Saddam Hussein's Iraq, deeply influenced American policymakers before September 11th, and certainly after. His book, Republic of Fear, about Saddam Hussein's totalitarian state, had a huge impact on President George W. Bush. Professor Makia, born in Baghdad, residing in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is a professor emeritus of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Brandey's University. In addition to his many academic books and articles are his more recent novels of historical fiction, The Rock, A Tale of 7th Century Jerusalem, and The Rope, about post-Saddam Iraq, and it is one of the best novels that helped me personally understand the challenges and the trials of post-invasion Iraq. On a personal note, one more thing, important thing, Kanaan also is the founder of the Iraq Memory Foundation, dedicated to preserving a record of Saddam Hussein's crimes among Iraqis. On a personal note, I want to say I met Kanaan first in 2004, during those fleeting moments when it looked as if Bush's freedom agenda in the Middle East might actually work out. Kanaan's hope and optimism for a better Middle East were somewhat infectious and inspiring to many of us. And I think many people here in the audience today are very privileged and happy that we can have him. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Kanaan's Makia and to host him here today via Zoom. The title of his talk is Looking Back at the 2003 Iraq War. And we only hope that next time we'll have the honor of having him here personally. Kanaan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yoav. Firstly, can you hear me fine?
Great, we can hear you terrific.
Okay, well, and thank you all of you in attendance at this conference. Thank you to the University of Tel-Aviv, which once honored me with an honorary degree some years back. I'm sure I have several friends in the audience whom I don't know, but I suspect I do. But particular thanks to Yoav for thinking of me on this occasion and making it happen. So I thought I would begin my comments with a very insightful assessment of the American failure in Afghanistan that was made recently in last August by Ryan Crocker, probably the preeminent Arabic-speaking American diplomat during the years that your conference is covering, that is since 9/11, and an individual who also served as ambassador in both Iraq and Afghanistan to different American presidents. It so happens that Crocker happened to play a very crucial role in the early months of the American occupation, in the formative early months of the American occupation of Iraq as well. So while we were all of us reeling from the extreme ineptitude of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, actually around the time that Yoav first contacted me, Crocker wrote these really interesting words. He is now, of course, a retired ambassador, probably could not have written this if he hadn't been. Quote, as the enormity of the events in Afghanistan this past week sinks in, the questions start. How did this happen? How could we not have foreseen it? Why didn't Afghan security forces put up a fight? Why didn't we do something about corruption? The list goes on, he writes. quote, "There is one overreaching answer. Our lack meaning the American lack of strategic patience at critical moments, including from President Biden. It has damaged our alliances, emboldened our adversaries, and increased the risk to our own security. It has also flouted 20 years of work and sacrifice," end of quote. Now, these questions that Crocker is asking about Afghanistan might as well have been asked about the American involvement in Iraq after 2003. The collapse of the Iraqi army in Mosul before the ragtag militia of ISIS in 2014 being a perfect analogy, a case in point. However, notice the failure is not being addressed by Ambassador Crocker in terms of whether it was quote unquote right or wrong to intervene in Afghanistan in the first place, much less is it about the rights or wrongs of nation building, if that is what the US was doing in Afghanistan. Lack of strategic patience is the all-important phrase Crocker uses. And this impatience, or short-termness, if you want to call it that, he is suggesting in the article is an intrinsically American characteristic. It is a quality or a way of doing international affairs very particular to the US, and apparently, I submit to you, independent of both moral questions about the use of military force and calculations of American geopolitical interests in the wake of a cataclysmic event as big as 9/11. It is therefore a factor in America's failure independent of conditions inside the two countries concerned, namely Iraq and Afghanistan, prior to the American decision to intervene. Now, we all remember that both interventions, the Afghani one and the Iraqi one, were justified as part of a so-called war on terror. Even though, I submit, the Iraqi intervention, which I supported, as you probably most of you know, was clearly a case of regime change rather than a war on terror. It was a case of regime change dressed up as a war on terror, as an extension of the war on terror. To be perfectly frank with you, I always thought that's what it was about, regime change, not as part of a war of terror. And that is why I threw my support, as you have mentioned, behind the overthrow of Saddam, because it was primarily about regime change and not because it was a war on terror. But I will come back to that point in a moment. In the meantime, it's important to note a serious problem with the notion of a war of terror. And this is something I draw upon things that my opinion, the really great political thinker, Michael Walzer, has written about. Like the notion of a war on crime or a so-called war on poverty, it isn't actually a war. What we have here is a case of metaphors getting in the way of political clarity. What the metaphor is supposed to suggest, the reason why it is constructed in the first place, is that the struggle against terrorism is a very difficult business. It is a serious business that requires long-term thinking and tough decisions. Military action ought to be a small and occasional part of a much bigger notion of, quote, struggle. Mostly it involves police work, ideological work, diplomatic action, and so on. But none of these tools work very well if one relies overwhelmingly on pure military force, which is what the US ended up doing in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, my focus, as I promised you when talking about this presentation, is Iraq, not Afghanistan. And there is one sense in which the American intervention in Iraq derives more closely from the lessons the US drew from the aftermath of 9/11 than it does in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, after all, just happens to be the territory where Al-Qaeda had based itself, so to speak, almost, by accident. The Arab world, on the other hand, was where the real problems that had produced 9/11 were situated. Addressing the root causes of 9/11 was never going to be about crushing this or that Arab terror group in a particular geographical location. It was about a generalized malaise, as I have described it in my books, that had gripped a whole region for decades, and of which Al-Qaeda was merely one among many other symptoms. The Arab world, not Afghanistan, was the birthplace of that malaise. And this is where Iraq, post 9/11, logically and rightly fitted into the picture of a rethinking of American foreign policy regarding the Middle East in a way that Afghanistan never could. Now, it surely will be conceded that this pivotal world-changing event we call 9/11 exposed the failings of the underpinning assumptions behind the whole edifice of American foreign policy in the Middle East, stretching back before it by about half a century. It is easy to forget this, especially in these days of the Abraham Accords and the cozying up to Mohammed bin Salman as part of the struggle to stand up to Iran. Saudi Arabia, let us not forget, America's most stalwart and consistent ally for over half a century, and around whose stability American foreign policy towards the whole Middle East was built, had produced monsters. And I submit to you, it is still producing them, but in a different guise than Osama bin Laden. And it behooves, I submit, all countries, not least of all Israel these days, to remember how and why such monsters were produced, even as they deal with a thug like Mohammed bin Salman commanding vast resources. But I am digressing. Back to Iraq. My point is that the whole way of thinking about how to do politics and diplomacy in the Arab world came under a new kind of scrutiny after 9/11, and rightly so. Let's face it, something about that old paradigm was exposed by 9/11 to be deeply flawed, if not downright rotten. Just because things have not turned out to have a fairy tale ending, we must still never forget that lesson of 9/11. Out of that paradigm shift is where the idea of regime change in Iraq was born, as supposedly the exemplar of a new way of thinking, one that it was hoped would associate America in Arab hearts and minds with a new kind of politics, not one subordinated to the whims of monarchs and tyrants. Common wisdom has it that the high hopes of the time of those times for Iraq have fallen flat on their face. Yes, there was an Arab Spring, and real elections, yes, were held in Egypt and in the West Bank. And yes, the Lebanese threw the Syrian army of occupation out of Lebanon. But all these gains, as we know, proved short-lived. And the most glaring failure of all, again, common wisdom has it, is precisely where all these gains found their starting point, in the American overthrow of the first Arab dictator, Saddam Hussein, after whom one after another of three, or was it four, Arab dictators began to fall like dominoes. The events are clearly connected. Now, looking back at the 2003 Iraq War, the title of my talk, I am ready to concede that from a strictly American point of view, regime change in Iraq has been a failure, at least in the way it was pursued and characterized by the, quote, strategic impatience, as Crocker called it, and which he was writing about. And failure tends, as we know, to create its own narrative, often at the expense of all the opportunities missed and the roads not taken, and at the expense of remembering what things were like before 2003, particularly in Iraq. But the same is not true. I said I would concede that from a strictly American point of view, regime change has been a failure. But the same is not equally true from an Iraqi point of view. To begin with, the real causes of the failings of regime change are due to Iraqis themselves and not to Americans. That was the whole point of my last book, which Yoav kindly referred to in his introductory remarks, the novel called The Rope. The American Coalition Provisional Authority, post-2003, can rightly be accused of all kinds of sins and blunders, but the evidence is simply overwhelming, which is the point of the novel, that the nucleus of today's Iraqi political elite, the one that was installed by American military action, this elite, and not the broad mass of Iraqis, nor even the erroneous faults and the very many mistakes of the Americans, this was played by far the more destructive role in whipping up a politics of victimhood that undermined national unity and tore the country apart, feeding into the sectarian civil war, especially of the period 2005-2007. However, in spite of all of that, a kind of little miracle occurred not so very long ago. And I'm talking about the fall of 2019, 16 years after the great tyrant was overthrown. I remind you of the massive demonstrations led not by Sunnis or by Kurds, but by young, sometimes very young Shia men and women against their own Shia-dominated Iraqi political class and against those among them in particular who had sold out their country to the Islamic Republic in Iran. These young men and women came out in their hundreds of thousands in Baghdad and in cities all over the south of Iraq. They were at the time, and there still are behind the scenes, many of them. The current prime minister, one Mustafa al-Kadhimi, a human rights activist for 20 years and a dear friend with whom I set up the Iraq Memory Foundation mentioned by Yoav in 2003, we set it up in Baghdad, owes his position as PM, about a year or so in duration, to those young demonstrators who had forced the resignation of his predecessor, a long-standing member of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, as it was called, an organization founded in Iran in 1982. Keep in mind the ironies of all of this, as I will simply mention them and we perhaps talk about them in the discussion. Al-Kadhimi's journey is a long story, too long for the time remaining to me, since there's a short presentation, and I hope you will have questions that can take us into your own concerns, not just mine. It's too long for me really to detail in these opening remarks. But as it so happens, Mustafa al-Kadhimi is also the person to whom I dedicated my last book, The Rope. And he, if you have been following the news in the last few days, has just narrowly escaped an assassination attempt a few days ago when the house he was living in, which used to be, incidentally, my family's house before Saddam expropriated it in 1972, another long story best left for another time, was subjected to an attack by 3 Iranian-made drones fired from the suburbs of Baghdad by Iranian Shia militias, proxies, Iranian proxies. These are the would-be little Hezbollahs of modern-day Iraq. Mercifully, Mustafa survived and lives to fight another day. What is my point? My point is that the story of Iraq is a sad one, to be sure, but it is not over. It is not a story of unmitigated failure and a failure that is cast in cement, so to speak, and as so many analysts and so-called political scientists would have you believe. Iraq has not yet been turned into a failed state. Perhaps it is on the brink of one, I grant you that, but it is not yet one in the way that, for instance, Lebanon has been turned into a failed state. It's a story post-2000, the story of Iraq post-2003 is a living and still unfinished one. And it is a story that would have been unimaginable had the great tyrant of Arab politics still been in power. To conclude, this is the gist of what I'm perhaps underlies my short presentation today. At certain great turning points in the lives of nations, it seems to me, politics is not and cannot be made out to be a matter of calculus, of the weighing up of costs versus benefits. It is sometimes, perhaps rarely, but still sometimes, a matter of conscience coupled to a calculus of the sort I have mentioned. Were that not the case, there might never have been laws to expand suffrage and civil rights, and wars fought to abolish slavery or to defeat fascism, and for the self-determination of nations and oppressed peoples. Why, there might never have even been a state of Israel, for there was nothing calculable or logical or scientific about the coming into existence of the state of Israel during the first half of the 20th century. There was no cost-benefit, strategic analysis, etc., that could have predicted its creation. I'm talking about the great mysteries that move men and women to act upon and change the organization of their political lives. There was no inexorable imperative that undid apartheid or that defeated totalitarianism. The passions of men and women brought these things into the world. Passions that more often than not had to fight against the odds, not with them. Therefore, anyone who was just counting the odds would have missed the point, would have missed the event. Yes, we all certainly made mistakes in the wake of 9/11, and the outcomes were not what we expected and hoped for. I mean, a country that has been under a totalitarian style of government dictatorship for the better part of 3 decades can hardly be expected to produce majorities of Democrats overnight. Nonetheless, it is still a new Middle East that we are now looking at. And in some ways, in spite of everything, it is a much better place than the old. And for that, I personally thank the United States. Thank you, Yoav.
Thank you so much, Kanaan. I want to leave a few minutes now to have a discussion and maybe to raise. I know a lot of people might have questions for you. I know I certainly have a few, so I'll open the floor first of all to the people here in the audience in terms of. Yeah. So please, yeah, Brandon, please go ahead.
Professor Makia, thank you first for sharing your time with us. It's a real honor to be able to hear your reflections on post 9/11 Iraq, so thank you. I wanted to ask about the young people you referred to who took to the streets so bravely in 2019 and ask they don't have a living memory of many of the events that you've written about and many of the events that we've spent time discussing today. So I would ask you as an Israeli sitting in Tel Aviv, what do you think is driving the young people in Iraq into the streets? What is animating them? What are they hoping and striving for as far as you see it and understand it? And what are their chances of achieving some of the things they're out in the streets demonstrating?
Thank you very much. Shall I take that, Yoav, now?
Please.
Yes. Well, firstly, it's really important to realize these are very young people. I mean, they do not probably have a memory of the Saddam Hussein years, a clear memory. They were children at the time. And these were extremely spontaneous uprisings. They leapfrogged from one city, from one neighborhood to the next. And they lack, therefore, all form of political organization at the time in 2019. Some of the leaders, many of whom I got to meet in later, afterwards, had to escape. They were targeted, but they have formed an opposition that even entered into the elections. Unfortunately, not as strongly as I had hoped, but nonetheless, they formed a party to the recent elections in Iraq. What were they rising up against? Well, several things. You could say the complete ineptitude of their ruling elites, the clear realization of the state of corruption, but also, and not at all in a secondary way, they were angry at what they saw as the selling out of their country by what was ironically now being viewed as an Iranian occupier, not an American one. Perhaps the phrase is a bit exaggerated, but it was the Iranian consulate that got burned down in I forget whether it was Najaf or Karbala, and it was Iranian influence and anti-Iranian chants that shook the postcards and placards that came out. And when the crushing of those demonstrations took place, it was snipers from these very same Iranian-backed militias hiding on roofs who were picking these individuals out. Just to show you how, it's one of those tiny little incidents that gives a sort of an aging person like myself a great deal of pleasure. They took the cover of my book, A Republic of Fear in Arabic, Jumhuriyat al-Khawf, and they put Jumhuriyat al-Qans. Al-Qans means sniping, because many of them were being targeted by snipers at the time in 2019 and early 2020, and walked around with placards, saying no to Jumhuriyat al-Qans with the cover of Republic of Fear on the poster. What I'm trying to get at is the crucial, their resentments were precisely that these leaders who were claiming to be acting on their behalf, were not acting on behalf of something bigger than their sect, were acting on behalf of themselves only, and not on behalf of Iraq. The most interesting political slogan that arose during those demonstrations is Nurid Watan, we want a country. By that, we want an Iraq. They were not talking about we want to have a greater share of the pie as Shiites. No, they were not saying we deserve more than the Kurds, or the Sunnis are our oppressors. Just the opposite. They were saying we want an Iraq. Now that, I think, is the deeply progressive core of what happened in the fall of 2019, and it has not been crushed by the killing of 600, 700 of them at the time. COVID came along and lots of other things did, and their own lack of organization has unfortunately played a big part in there. But they're there. They are a latent force that's present, and they are single-handedly responsible for the existence of the current prime minister. I mean, now, there are certain things I could talk about. You see, the state, when these young men and women rose up in the Shia governorates of the southern half of Iraq, they were, the state itself that they were opposing and that they were criticizing was divided on itself. And needless to say to you, amongst parts of the state defended the demonstrators, while other parts of the state attacked them and participated and fed information to the Iranian militias that were shooting them down. I say this without going into further detail, although I have the detail, because it's a very indicative of where we're at. And their champion at the time was Mustafa al-Kadhimi, And so the story, that's why the gist of my comments are to say this story is not over by any means at all. And we are now in a very interesting moment, political moment, full of promise and full of danger. Why? Because the drone attacks on Mustafa al-Kadhimi have enormously extended his popularity. The clear association with Iran is there. It's not yet been stated. And the militias that are responsible for that drone attack are primarily rebelling against the fact that they lost so heavily in the recent elections. They did so badly. They did so badly that they felt power potentially slipping from their grasp in a new parliament and in a new government that might be likely to be formed. And as a consequence, they resorted to this extreme action, which mercifully was a failure, and which could very well have plunged Iraq into civil war once again. So it is a very watershed moment, and we don't know exactly which way it's all going to turn out.
All right, great. I'll take two more questions because we have to. We have the next panel already setting up. Yes, please. Do you want to?
Hello to Professor מאקיה from Lior Lukitz.
Hello. How are you?
Thank you for being there, at least virtually. I have two questions. One is about Muqtada al-Sadr, your view about his victory in the election. And secondly, any possibility of having him and Noor al-Maliki forming some sort of coalition?
What my views on Muqtada al-Sadr are essentially at the heart of the novel The Rope. He is an extremely unstable, populist, demagogic character who is potentially a great danger. However, at the moment, he is standing up against the Iran-backed militias that he is a major force against them. But he is a frightening character. As to a coalition between him and Maliki, I think that's unlikely, but I think from what I know, the relations between the two men are very bad, and there's no respect lost. Don't forget, Maliki attacked the then militia of Muqtada al-Sadr himself back when he was prime minister, 2005, 2006, and memories of that period are not gone completely. So I hope that answers your questions.
Great. One more question that we received via email. A few people really were asking this, so I'll bundle them together into one question, and it's the question of I think what was implicit in your comments, and certainly you've written about this in the past, is the question that it was the war in Iraq from an American perspective a failure of means as opposed to ends, right? In terms of the goal was correct, in your opinion, but the problem was the means through which they achieved that, whether it was, Bremer's decision to disband the army and de-Ba'athify and all of these kind of tactical decisions, which really did prove catastrophic. So was it only a question of, had they done things differently, things would have worked out? Or is it just a question of these goals were unfeasible, which is something that a lot of Israelis feel, a lot of Middle Eastern scholars certainly suggest, right? That this could never have worked no matter what the United States did, because Iraq is not ready for democracy. And you know that argument, of course. Yeah. So elaborate, please.
So, Yoav, I definitely think it was, first of all, I go back to a main point of my talk. The main failure in Iraq, I submit, is not an American one. The Americans made every mistake in the book that you can think of, and even more, and they behaved, an error after error. But it was up to Iraqis to lose the golden opportunity that America had given them, which was to get rid of the tyrant, which they themselves could not and had not been able to do for reasons that we could talk about. And it was Iraqis who in the end lost Iraq, or failed to live up to the promises of that time. That is the central point I tried to make in my talk. So no, there was nothing wrong with the main goal of getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And the reason here, I want to stop here for a second and remind listeners of the state of affairs just prior to the fall of Saddam Hussein. We had a regime that had launched one aggressive war after the other, against whom an extraordinary regime of sanctions had been applied since the early 1990s. And those sanctions were slowly falling apart and losing their effectiveness. Instead of weakening the regime, they were pauperizing the population and destroying the middle class, destroying the intelligentsia, and by contrast, in relation to whom the regime was getting stronger and stronger. So we had a situation where there was no hope. That's a very important word. That is, there was no way out for Iraq to emerge on its own. And there is therefore no reason to think that there would have been, that he would not still be in power if he had not been removed. The rest of the Arab Spring, there's also another important thing. The overthrow of Saddam signified that something that had been taken for granted, namely the Arab world is populated by despots, monarchs, and tyrants, was no longer in the, so to speak, psychological atmosphere of politics everywhere in the Arab world itself. Young men and women, and not so young ones either, began to see it was possible to get rid of them. And important things happened. The Arab Spring was a failure, yes, but we don't begin with the failure. We begin also with what it was at the beginning. One Arab dictator after another fell. That showed you how precarious, how fragile the whole system of Arab politics had become after what I call the malaise of 30 to 40 years in the making. Malaise that it's another subject entirely, and I have written about it, but a malaise, in my opinion, connected with the 67 war, the outcomes of the way in which the Arab world dealt or was unable to deal with defeat in 67, but this is a separate subject. I don't want to digress onto that. So breaking the logjam of Arab politics, however clumsily it may have been done, was, it seems to me, not something that we should in any way, shape, or form regret. Yes, there were better ways of doing it. Yes, could have been done over a longer period of time, and different forms of government come into being. All sorts of options existed. All sorts of roads were not taken that might have been taken. But let's remember also some of the positive things. 25% of Iraq's population, its Kurds, have lived in relative freedom because of it. They have a form of administration. Life in the three northern governorates is much better than it is in Baghdad and the south. The Kurds have also their own failings and their own corruption, problems with corruption and so on. But these are transformed situations. Young Kurdish men and women are producing art, are writing novels, are turning out books. And this is something else about Baghdad, about the changes that took place in Iraq. You simply cannot have absolutist politics, absolutist dictatorship in a country like Iraq, in the short term, at least in the next 10, 20 years, because the ability of the state to control what goes on in the streets is completely gone. And as a consequence, hundreds of sites, websites, social media, books, bookstores, journals, magazines, all sorts of forms of writing are popping up, new forms of writing, literature, poetry, which is outward looking. It seeks the world. Here's a little ironical comment. In my generation, the young Iraqis' level of, even though standards of teaching foreign languages like English were much higher than they are now, their English was poor. They could not communicate. Young Iraqis who hardly have any proper education anymore because the educational system has taken a serious beating in recent decades, speak perfect English because they learn their English off the World Wide Web and the internet, and they converse in English and they switch backwards and forwards between languages. This is new. This is completely new. These young people are the hope. They are not in politics. Unfortunately, it's my generation, my failed generation, that is in power. But it is these young people coming up, and they are the ones who came out on the streets in 2019. They have opportunities now, amidst difficulties, to be sure, that never existed before Saddam Hussein was overthrown.
All right, so I think on that hopeful note, an optimistic note, I want to thank you very much. And everyone here, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Yoav, and thank you all of you.
Both here in the audience and at home, we are so glad